Last week, Joe Biden signed an executive order that will forgive $10,000 for student loan debt for borrowers who make less than $125,000 per year and $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients. This will wipe out approximately $1.5 billion in debt for students all over this country. Now, this is a potential game changer for Americans, many of whom are drowning in debt, as it will give tens of millions of borrowers some much needed breathing room. Now, although the response has been overwhelmingly positive for most Americans, Republicans and even some Democrats are whining about how this plan will increase inflation, and others simply say it's unfair. What about folks who already paid off their loans? And what about those folks that didn't go to college? Why should those elite people that went to college get this break? Today, we're talking to experts and someone who borrowed over six figures in loans to finance his education to see what they have to say about Biden's plan to reduce student loan debt. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Biden's plan is a really big deal for about 43 million borrowers who will receive relief. Now, even though some want to paint these students as the elite, what we know is that most of the students that will receive some kind of student loan relief are actually low and middle income Americans. And we also know that this student loan plan is going to cost the country about $300 billion. But that's kind of a drop in the bucket when you think that the U.S. economy is worth about $25 trillion. But not surprisingly, Ted Cruz and the loud MAGA crowd are whining that the debt forgiveness plan is bad for the country. Now, these same Republicans have selective amnesia when it comes to the massive bailouts that this country has given to big corporations and to high net worth individuals. But I wanted to ask an economist this morning about this argument that Biden's plan is somehow going to increase inflation and cost the everyday American a lot more on their tax bill. Joining me is Dr. Julianne Malveaux. She is an economist. She's the former president of Bennett College, and she's currently the dean or a dean at Cal State Los Angeles. Good morning and welcome, my friend, Dr. Malveaux. Needed to talk to an economist this morning because all of these arguments about why this plan is bad, many of them center on this notion that somehow this plan is going to cause inflation to go through the roof. And before you answer that or tell us if that's true or not, help us understand what the Biden plan actually does.
Let's give Joe Biden a shout out. It's a step in the right direction. It's not as much as many people want it, but it's a good thing. It forgives, as you said earlier, $10,000 to anyone who has an outstanding federal student loan. This only covers federal loans, which are in the Department of Education's portfolio. So many people have other loans, private loans, etc. Those will not be forgiven. If you had a Pell Grant when you took out your loan, you'll get $20,000 worth of loan forgiveness. More importantly, Areva, and the part that people are really not focusing on, it changes the terms of repayment. So today, before the bill and all the regs haven't been promulgated yet, your student loan repayment was capped at 10% of your gross income. So you made 70 grand, you're going to have to pay 7 grand. And you would pay that for 20 years until the balance was paid off. Mm-hmm. Under the new plan, you pay 5%. So as opposed to the 70 grand person making 7,000, pay back 7,000, they pay back 3,500. Okay. And you only will pay it for 10 years, not 20. I actually think...
Let me stop you there, Dr. Malveaux. So great. So that means you have more income on a monthly basis because rather than having to pay out 7,000, you're paying out 3,500. So there's more discretionary income that you have, and you can go out into the economy and put money into the economy. But you said it also reduces the time period from, say, a 20-year repayment
right, to 10 years.
10. It changes it. but you're paying less money in a shorter period of time, so you're not going to pay it all off. What happens to whatever balance may remain?
The balance will remain. It'll be forgiven, actually. It will be forgiven. But look, if you look at it, most people, Areva, unless they have catastrophic things happen to them, most years your income goes up. Over a 10-year cycle, your income goes up. So I gave you the $70,000 possibility. That might be what a teacher makes in, let's say, New York or perhaps LA. That's about an average for a teacher there. Well, that teacher will be getting 2, 3, 4, 5% increases every year. So they will pay more than we're thinking they'll pay now if they're basically seeing income increases. Right. So I don't necessarily, let me just delve a little bit. What happens when people have these crippling student loans? It postpones their adulthood. You have people who are still living in their mama's basements. You have people who would like to buy a home, but they can't because they're paying back student loans. You have people who are in their 50s who are still paying back student loans, who are thinking, well, what about my retirement? Right. We have people who are also thinking, I'd like to help my kids, but I can't help myself because I can't pay back my loans. But for young people who are maybe between, I say 25 and 35, it postpones their adulthood. They can't make adult decisions. Some young women are postponing, young married couples postponing having children until they get their loans paid down. So this is a good thing. And, I graduated undergrad with, I think, maybe $3,000, $4,000 worth of debt. And I had a full ride. So the only debt I had was because I was crazy. Like I took out a loan to go to Mexico one time. Another time I took out a loan to go to Africa.
Well, let me stop you there because that's one of the complaints too. And I've heard people say, well, why should we forgive this debt when a lot of people do what Dr. Malvo has just admitted she did? They take out loans not to pay tuition or housing costs or to buy books, but to take lavish trips. They
were not lavish trips and they were educational. I went to Mexico with a group of economists. I had left the country, but it was a trip where we visited banks and did all that. So it was educational. Most of my classmates, my mom was a single mom. Most of my classmates did not have to borrow. Their parents paid for it. It was a school-sponsored loan, school-sponsored trip. And my professor said, you could use your student loan money for this. And since I had a full ride and had no other debt, why not? Now, the Africa trip is another story. But I do believe it also benefited my education in the long run and maybe the person that I am. And again, people who come from working class, and I can't say was working class, both of my parents had doctorate, but my mom was a single mom. And there were 5 of us. So she wasn't doing all that. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, with her ignorant self, has been running around talking about, well, it's just not fair. That heifer, I cleaned it up, she did not pay back nearly $200,000 in PPP loans. So she does not need to.
You brought that up because that's one of the questions I want to ask you. We see the White House using its social media account to call out these Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and others who got PPP loans and saying, look, you guys are criticizing this plan to relieve student loan debt, but you got PPP and didn't pay it back. Now, of course, if you turn to Fox News, Fox will say, well, that's not an apples to apples comparison. The folks that got the PPP, it was understood at the beginning that this was loan money to be used to pay your employees during a pandemic, and it was always meant to be forgiven. They say student loan debt, on the other hand, and this is just the argument that the Fox people are making, this is not Areva's argument, that student loan debt, you take it out and you have every intention and you make an obligation to pay it back. So they're saying that they're not the equivalent of each other. What do you say to that as an economist?
They're not the exact equivalent, but the principle is the same. Not whether you are intending to pay it back or not, but whether or not you're being subsidized. Essentially, whether you got a student loan, a PPP loan, or some other kind of loan, you're being subsidized. And in civil society, somebody is always subsidizing somebody. We know that happens when people don't pay as much into their Social Security as they get out. We can talk about other kinds of examples where people basically don't pay what was put in. It's civil society 101. Furthermore, Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing nothing more than fomenting class warfare. That's what she's attempting to do. She cites the example of the plumber who didn't get to go to college. What about the teacher who probably makes about the same as a plumber and is basically saddled with all this debt?
Yeah, let me just say that I'm glad you're making that distinction because, yes, there is this argument that's happening on the right that somehow everybody goes to college as a part of some elite class. And as you just said, teachers and nurses and people who do perform essential functions, even the people that serve you your coffee at Starbucks, many of them are college educated, and they are far from, this so-called elite, people who have trust funds and who come from wealthy families. And they're trying to lump all of these people together and suggest that the plumber is somehow different than the teacher. And as you just stated, many of them make the same amount of money.
Or the teacher might make less. Quite frankly, if we look at, if we look at some of this, the dropping of Ivy League schools is deceptive. What percentage of all college students go to Ivy League schools? It represents less than 2%. Then let's talk about the number of Ivy League students, mostly not black or brown, who go with very little loan money because they're coming from very wealthy families. So again, they're the ones who keep comparing apples to oranges. Take it even further. 80% of the student loan relief is going to go to people who earn less than $75,000 a year. So again, this is not subsidizing the wealthy. People who earn less than $75,000 a year, what they're our teachers, our nurses, our social workers. Look at the federal or state, basically income salaries. You can find them easily. I have faculty members at Cal State who don't make $100,000, as people keep talking about. They make sometime between 75 and 90. So this is a deliberate attempt to foment class warfare and to paint these crazy Republicans as if they're victims, which they are not. Areva, if we really look at some of this, the Trump tax cuts, let's talk about those for a minute.
You read my mind. That was my next question.
$2.3 trillion forgiven. $2.3 trillion. We're talking about at max with the student loan forgiveness. At max, it'll be like $1 billion. At max.
Now, let me ask you this, Dr. Malvo, because I've read that the student loan forgiveness is $300 billion. Why does the number vary so much? You said $1 trillion. I've read $300 billion. I know economists, get to different conclusions based on their assumptions, but that's a wide gap. $300 billion to $1 trillion.
Well, the Congressional Budget Office actually says it's about $605 billion when you include loan forgiveness, the forbearance, and the income, the repayment. They say that the Congressional Budget Office, which is a politically relatively neutral group, and most people use their estimates. I've seen other estimates, but then what they say footnote is if other assumptions change, it can be as much as $1 trillion. And so there are always assumptions. What can happen? Inflation could go up, not for this, but what if inflation went up for another reason? Right now, Mark Zandi, who's one of the most, I respect him, very good economic forecaster, he says it will raise inflation by less than 0.8 of a percentage point. So, where
are the Republicans getting this talking point that this is going to raise inflation? Where is that coming from?
They're crazy minds, essentially. Okay. When I was at grad school, I took a class, and the class was titled, "You Can Lie with Statistics." And basically, the professor, who at that time was a public policy wonk, before we had all these talking heads on television, he did a little bit of that. And he would talk about how you could take data and massage it to come up with the answer that you wanted. So basically, they want the answer that says it's inflationary because people are frightened of inflation. And especially right about now with what's going on with the Fed. Jerome Powell has been so, I don't want to say wishy-washy, but he's sort of priming the pump for we might have more inflation. He's already said he's going to raise interest rates at least twice more before the end of the year. And the last two rates of 0.75% were, many of us think, way too high. If he follows up with that 2 more times, that will be inflationary, but it won't be because someone got some forgiveness on their student loans. If you look at what people are doing, what people are going to get is a little bit of wiggle room. They're not going to get a lot. When I was president at Bennett, one of the things I did, which was not illegal, but if it is, the statute of limitations is over. You're not supposed to look at students' debt, but I would get financial aid to send me the list every year just so I could see. We usually had, been in a small college, 100, 150 students graduating. And I just looked. And I saw some young ladies who had very little debt, but saw some that were hitting on six figures of debt. And they usually came from families that were very income challenged, where they had to take out loans for everything, down to we made it possible in a couple of instances for students to take out loans to get clothing for their first set of interviews. Now, we also had a clothes closet where I encouraged alums, and they were very generous in giving clothes, interview clothes, but everybody ain't the same size and all that. So, if someone had to take out an extra $500, so she had a jacket, a couple of jackets and a couple of skirts, hey, that was helping her to the next level. So some folks have.
I want to ask you, because you talked about how the student loan debt has delayed maturity for some students. Is student loan debt, does that also delay students getting higher paying jobs? Because I'm wondering, if we give them some debt relief and they can get higher paying jobs, they'll pay more taxes and that'll benefit the economy.
Absolutely, but there are two sides to that. Absolutely, they can get better paying jobs, often because employers will run a credit report on you. Employers will know, because if you're in the financial industries, employers will know that you're fiscally vulnerable, which means you might take a bribe, you might steal, if you have a low credit score. So they're not likely to take a chance on you. But the flip side is this. Many young people who want to go into public service, they have a college degree, they want to be a cop, or they want to be a teacher in an inner city school. But they have an offer. One who wants to be a cop could also be a Wall Street lawyer. They're going to make more money as a Wall Street lawyer than as a cop. But we need folks with good sense on the police force. We need people who have degrees, who have sense. We're woefully lacking that now. They're going to take the highest paying job so they can get rid of their loan. And so it's a mixed bag, but we do know that people will pay more taxes. People will be better participants in the economy. So this is a win. My problem with President Biden right now is that.
Before you get to Biden, I want to go back to Trump. You mentioned that $2.3 trillion. Was that the amount of debt that was wiped out by the Trump tax bill that he got enacted, like his first year in office?
No, that's what it cost us. It cost us at least $2.3 trillion. And again, just like I gave you the number on the other side, could be as much as $4 trillion it costs, depending on a number of assumptions. Trump and his team assume that we get 3% growth every year. We haven't hit it every year. Now, the last couple of years we have hit it, but it looks like we're slowing down. So there are a number of assumptions that go into this, but that's how much money we lost. That's what it cost.
But to also talk about other kinds of subsidies. So I love that you brought up this issue of subsidies, because when you hear these fairness arguments, I'm thinking about the bank bailouts, I'm thinking about airline bailouts, I'm thinking about farmers, not black farmers, the big white conglomerate farmers who've all gotten bailouts. Should we be talking more about that? I'm thinking about a student, $10,000. If you have, like, one of your students that been in college, $100,000, that's something. But that's nothing compared to the huge corporate subsidies that this country has historically provided to big businesses.
No, absolutely right. I'll give you an example that I love. Many cities will build a stadium and subsidize the building of the stadium on the grounds that stadium is going to bring revenue. The game comes, it's going to bring revenue back to the city. But you're subsidizing some humongous team that's owned by a bunch of millionaires with the notion that you get some trickle back of tax revenue from them. Well, everybody in the city is paying for that subsidy that the city gave to the multi-billion-dollar sports teams. Everybody's paying it, whether you're at the top of the income distribution or at the bottom. I paid it. I don't like sports. Why am I paying? You
can say, I don't go to those games. Why should I be subsidizing that stadium? I don't even like football.
Exactly.
So make the same arguments that these people were saying, well, I didn't go to college. Or, one of the most ridiculous arguments is, I didn't get my student loan debt, relieved. I paid mine off. So why should these, privileged students get something?
First of all, they're not all privileged. They're not all privileged, number one. Number two, the cost of higher education has increased exponentially. In the past decade, it's gone up by more than 20%. If you compare the time, I was an undergrad class of 74. Tuition, room and board at Boston College, I think, was $2,500. If I look at Boston College now, tuition room and board is hitting on 50 plus. So, and that's just in a 30, 40-year period.
So how do we address that? Because the bigger issue here, we can't relieve all the debt that students are going to have to take out to go to college. But college tuition is too high, whether it's a UCLA or a private college like Boston College. What are we doing, if anything, as a nation to address that bigger issue?
That is a bigger issue, and we're not doing very much about it. President Biden addressed it in his talk last Wednesday. He talked about the cost of education. He had the education secretary sitting next to him, and they talked about looking into it and having a commission and grading colleges on their success rates in terms of graduation. But I didn't hear anything that said we're going to try to put a break on some of these increasing costs. Now, from the flip side, I do understand costs going up. You know, if you're a college president, you got to pay. Your faculty wants a raise. Electricity costs go up. You got maintenance. All of those occur. So things, but they don't go up as much as tuition goes up. Mm-hmm. So we really need to talk
where's
about
all that money going? I mean, we know some of these schools are big sports powerhouses, so they're financing these, elaborate sports teams. But in general, you having been a college president yourself, where does all of this, additional money go beyond what is needed to pay your staff and, keep the lights on?
It depends on the school. At small HBCUs and at small liberal arts colleges, it doesn't go anywhere. Some of these schools go into debt, and as you know, we've lost a couple of HBCUs and many of our smaller liberal arts colleges. At the Harvard end, the other end, I mean, Harvard has, I don't know how much they have, so I don't want to start lying. But if you took all the HBCU endowments and combined them, that's Harvard. You take all of the HBCU endowment and then combine them rather. So what you're looking at is sometimes they're saving the money or investing the money or using the money for something else. They claim they have a rainy day fund. Well, it doesn't rain for 10 years. So, what you really know is that these folks are essentially, higher education is an economic enterprise. It's not just about education. It's about economics. And so when you talk about these surpluses, we need to go through and look at them and look at where this money indeed is going. I find myself basically flabbergasted at the Harvards, Princetons, Yales, Dartmouths, and how much they're able to accumulate. Meanwhile, crying poor and raising tuition at the same time.
It's just, yeah. Don't get me started on those Ivies. I got a serious bone to pick with them, but I got to talk to you about Joe Biden before I let you go, because you said you had an issue with him, and I told you to wait. I wanted to talk about Trump, but go ahead, tell me your issue with Joe Biden.
Poor communications, that's all. I mean, I think this student loan forgiveness is a huge coup. He promised it during the campaign. He's done it. But as I said earlier, the part about the capping the repayment and shortening the time, did you know that? I mean, did you really hear that from him when you heard the announcement?
I definitely did not hear the part about shortening the repayment period, which is huge, because when I heard it, I was like, really? That's major.
Exactly. So I don't understand. I mean, Corinne Jean-Pierre is a great young woman. I think she did a really great job with Kamala as her communications person. I don't think she does as good a job as Jen Psaki was doing with President Biden. And it's not just her. It's he does not toot his own horn or beat his own drum. And this is the problem with Democrats now. Democrats have done some really great things, but you'd never know it because they don't tell anybody. You've got Marjorie Taylor. Now, I would give you props for going off on her behind. And everybody needs to just go off on her. I mean, that little witch. But anyway, don't get me started. We keep it civil. So, but in any case, Democrats just have to do a better job of tooting their own horn. President Biden has really smart people surrounding him. If he doesn't want to do it, send Kamala out there. This is a perfect issue for her.
She got a lot of credit, though, Dr. Malveaux, for the $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients, because as you know, the majority of Pell Grant recipients happen to be African American. Mm-hmm. And she fought hard. That was a big issue for her to make sure that amount of loan forgiveness is actually double the $10,000. It's actually $20,000. So everyone that has followed her career and know that that's been a big issue for her, has given her a lot of credit for that. But
she deserves that credit, but then put her out there. Let her talk about it. I mean, there's a historic tension, and I'm not saying they have it, but there's always been a historic tension between the president and the vice president in terms of who gets airtime, who gets attention. President Biden could deputize Kamala to go out and talk about this, talk about it, in the communities where people are on the fence about voting. We need to keep the House in 2022. We need to try to grab a couple Senate seats in 2022. But what we're seeing is that 25 to 35-year-old group, even 25 to 40-year-old group, they don't like politics. Well, you don't have to like politics. You're not going to bed with it. All you have to do is go vote. And when the Biden administration trumpets some of their victories, it encourages people to vote.
No, absolutely. And, I got to give Biden a lot of credit because we were seeing him out more. He gave a major speech yesterday. He's going to give another major speech. His Twitter, the White House Twitter account has been on fire. They've been calling out these Republicans who have been making these hypocritical statements and somehow suggesting that this $10,000 loan relief is some kind of huge benefit to these low and middle income students who so desperately needed this relief. Thank you so much, Dr. Malvo, for joining me this morning, helping us make sense of this. And so I just want to make sure we're clear on the answer. So this plan, student loan relief plan, is not going to be a major factor in increasing inflation. Is your answer? Tell me your answer to that.
The answer is it will not. The student loan forgiveness plan is not inflationary. The most it will add is 1/10 of a percentage point. The most it will add is 1/10 of a percentage point. It will not.
That talking point, when I talk to my conservative friends, I got it from Dr. Malvo, a nationally recognized economist. It will not increase inflation. Period. All right, I got it. I'm good to go. Thank you, Dr. Malvo. See you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. My next guests are here. They've been working on some of these policies related to student loan debt, as well as, addressing this issue of the cost of education, higher education. Jared Bass, he's a senior director at the Senior Director of Higher Education at the Center for American Progress. And Ariel Taylor Smith is here. She is a senior director at National Parents Union Policy and Action Center. Good morning, Jared, and good morning, Ariel.
Good morning.
So you guys both heard Dr. Malvo say emphatically this student loan debt plan is not going to increase inflation, or if it does, it's marginal at best. Why do you think we're having, Jared, the kind of negative reaction that we're seeing from Republicans? Republicans have kids who got student loans and who are going to benefit. Republicans themselves, setting aside the PPP loans, many of them have student loan debt, so they're going to benefit. I don't think they're going to, turn down the application, turn down the $10,000 that they may be entitled to. So why all the whining?
Student loan borrowers represent Democrats, Republicans, independents, and everything in between. So we really should have a bipartisan conversation when it comes to debt cancellation. We should have a bipartisan conversation when it comes to fixing the higher education system for sure. I think it really just comes down to philosophical differences around government and how government runs, how it's functioned, and how it can benefit people. The president took action to actually provide benefit and relief to borrowers, while also acknowledging that we need to address some of the root causes of why debt cancellation should have been used in the first place. I think you also see it in some of the ideas that come out and the differences between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to higher education. There was a bill that just came out a few weeks ago from the ranking member on the Education and Labor Committee, that their answer to solving the debt crisis is actually limiting loans, limiting opportunity, getting rid of public service loan forgiveness, getting rid of those repayment programs, and reducing some of the assistance to borrowers. And we see the president on the other side taking action to relieve borrowers' burden, from student loan debt, and also making repayment easier for most borrowers going forward.
Yeah, Ari, I want to talk to you about the role of race, because your organization issued a statement, and a part of that, or one of the phrases in that statement that really caught my attention, is equality is not equity. And for me, as I hear some of these complaints, a lot of them sound like coded language to really say, we don't want to help those Black and brown people because they mismanage their money, they're lazy, they don't save, they don't, support their children, they don't pay for their tuition. I hear a lot of that, even though it's not being said in that explicit or in those explicit, terms. But we all know that race is, inextricably tied to everything we do in this country. And definitely when we talk about who benefits from government assistance. So talk to us some about why your organization issued that statement, and what did you mean when you said equality is not equity?
I mean, white borrowers, the average white borrower in our country holds about $12,000 in student loan debt. The average Black woman borrower owes about $52,000. And so we know that the amount of debt held by different subgroups in our country is unequal. And that is because of systematic inequality in our country that has existed for decades. And this is just one of the ways that it's playing out. I will just say that this is a middle class economic stimulus. I think that that's really important to note, is that this is something that's helping middle class families make payments and start lives in ways that are, I think, going to change the game for them. If you look at how much we were talking earlier about a public school teacher and how much they pay in their student loans, right now they pay $197 on average a month in student loans. And this will reduce their payment to $56 a month. And so I think that there's real savings to the average American that's noteworthy here, but unfortunately, it's not equal.
Can you give us a little bit more about why such the disparity? The $12,000 for the average student, a white student borrower, versus the $52,000 for the average Black woman who has student loan debt. Obviously, there's some systemic issues that you made reference to, but is there anything that, in addition that's at play that creates that huge gulf?
Yeah, generational wealth, and the fact that the cost of college has increased exponentially, while at the same time the amount of support from federal programs has actually not kept up. And so there's this gap that exists. Pell Grants used to cover about 80% of the cost of college for families. And now they cover about 30%. And so the only way to go to college is if you figure out a way to come up with the money that is in between how much you get in federal support and how much you are going to have to pay every year. And so the reality of that is that if you have a family who can pay, you don't have to take out debt. And so, unfortunately, generational wealth has created inequities in our higher education system that are really worth looking at and solving.
A great point about the generational wealth and how it has such ripple effects throughout our economy. Jared, I want to ask you, though, about Ariel said that this is a middle-class stimulus package. That sounds very positive, sounds very favorable. Whenever we hear about things benefiting the middle class, people seem to be in favor of it. Why do you think we're not hearing that frame more often? Because what we are hearing is what Dr. Malvo said, is this effort to foment dissension between the plumber and the teacher, both who would be considered middle class in this country. So, help us understand, why aren't we thinking about this as a middle class stimulus?
I think we also need to just dispel the notion that plumbers don't have loans. Some plumbers actually go to college. Some plumbers actually got loans on behalf of themselves to learn their trade or on behalf of their children. There are plumbers with children who have taken out loans on behalf of their children for their children to have that economic opportunity that they themselves didn't have. And so I'm
just glad you said that, because again, that's one of those Republican talking points that's easy to kind of start parroting, is that somehow blue collar workers don't have loans or they don't go to college. There are lots of programs, whether you are an electrician or a plumber or you're a construction worker. We know there's all kinds of private colleges that many individuals that work in those trades will attend, and they will have student loan debt.
Right. And also our community colleges provide workforce development programs as well. So it's ingrained into the system. So we're not just talking about philosophers. We're talking about people who, may be working in your house, next week. We're talking about people who have learned a trade, and they'll benefit from this as well. Student debt is felt within, every corner of the United States. It's felt within every community. And so this should be, or, could be a unifying moment for our country. We're a nation that responds to crisis. When there's a crisis in one part of the country, we band together, we help people. And I think that this is the same opportunity that, presents itself through debt cancellation, or at least it should be. But I think that we're just having this moment where we're pitting Americans versus Americans, and we really shouldn't be doing that because of who student loan borrowers are. They're poor people, they're middle income people, they're not just rich people. The president talked about how the aid will be concentrated. 90% of the aid, almost 90% of the aid will be concentrated for people making under $75,000. There'll be an additional $10,000 in relief for Pell Grant recipients. And most of those people, their families make less than $60,000 a year, which is well below the median average as far as income and wealth. So I think that those are the things that we need to be talking about when it comes to higher education. Also, this is benefiting communities as well. People are going to start small businesses, they'll have families, they'll invest in their communities. We may see people move back into their rural communities because they don't have to go into the city, into urban areas to get a job to pay off their student loans. We may see more community investment and more community stability as well.
Yeah, great points. Jalen Sanders has joined us. Jalen is a graduate of the University of Baltimore School of Law. He actually has 3 degrees, and Jalen has 6 figures in student loan debt. He joined us a while back on a show we did about student loan debt, and I wanted to have you back, Jalen, to get your reaction. A lot of promises by the president about addressing student loan debt, and finally, last week, the day is here. What was your initial reaction when you learned that Joe Biden had signed this executive order actually wiping out $1.5 billion in student loan debt?
Honestly, my reaction, I was very underwhelmed because when you do the mathematics around it, that's about $20,000 to $40,000 per person. And on average, the average student, as mentioned before, from both low income and high income housing have accumulated so much more debt than that. And then to turn around and see different U.S. efforts, such as the efforts in Ukraine, different taxes rising, so on and so forth, it just felt like a Band-Aid on a broken leg. And it was meant to kind of coddle the people, not necessarily invoke or make important change.
That's a great point, Jalen. And we've heard that, Ariel, from others. Jalen, I assume you consider yourself a Democrat. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, the reason I ask is because we've heard Democrats like you say they were underwhelmed, said this wasn't nearly enough, and said that, Biden needed to go further. What do you say to that, Ariel, for those people like Jalen who says, look, this is not going to have a significant impact on my bottom line, and the president didn't go far enough?
It should have an impact on your bottom line because the amount that you're able to pay, that you are allowed to pay a month, has decreased. So if you're still left with debt after this cancellation, you will have caps on the amount of monthly payments that you'll be able to make. That's all income based. I think that there's a lot of room to do a lot more because, in a lot of ways, this is a Band-Aid if we don't solve the fact that college is not accessible to all people across the country, because if you can't afford it and you don't want to take out loans, you essentially can't go. And so I think that there's some steps that need to be taken. I think we need to talk about doubling Pell Grants. As I mentioned before, Pell Grants used to cover about 80% of college costs for families. Now they cover about 30%. So continuing the expansion of the Pell Grant program, making community college free, and continuing to build rules around income-driven repayment, which is sort of what I was referring to before, that your income will be capped, or the amount of payment you'll be making will be capped based on your income.
And Jalen,
do you mind if I?
Go ahead, Jalen.
Oh, I apologize. You can go first. I brought up several thoughts.
I don't know if you were listening when Dr. Malvo talked about a provision of the plan that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and that is the change in the repayment schedule. I think that has to have a huge impact on all borrowers. Were you familiar with that part of it?
I was familiar with the change in repayment schedule, and as Ms. Ariel had brought up as well. However, I think the large part of the conversation that's being missed is where theoretical fails to meet reality. It doesn't matter how long you prolong my repayment, whether or not you cap my repayment, or whether or not it's a provision altering the terms of my repayment. That's still a large amount of money due, and it's kind of perpetually keeping me in debt because we still haven't necessarily fleshed out. Based on my readings, I could be wrong, and I'm open to correction. Interest rates, the level of interest rates how colleges and schools that are public institutions will be limited on not upping their prices to alter how much is required for you to take out a loan, because you can pass any law you want. You can change how much money I pay you now versus how much money I pay you later. It's still going to be due. And then the cost of school is still going to be rising. And it just doesn't make sense.
No,
so that's why I keep saying
rising tuition costs. I think all of us are in complete agreement. Something needs to be done because college, as Ariel said, Dr. Malvo said as well, it's just unaffordable and it's rising at an exponential level. But let's talk about that interest piece. Jared, is there anything about the interest rate? Jalen raises the point of nothing has changed in terms of his interest rates. Is there anything in the bill that addresses that?
Yeah, so in the president's announcement, I think the part that speaks to interest is income-driven repayment. So right now, under income-driven repayment programs, your interest and the unpaid interest actually gets added to your balance. And so it's something called negative amortization, where you can actually see any unpaid interest getting added. And then it just gets added to the balance, and then you end up having like ballooning balances. So the president has actually proposed subsidizing interest. So if you don't pay enough to cover both interest and principal, like you can actually have that interest subsidized, so it doesn't keep up with that ballooning balance. I mean, I think it speaks to something else as well, is that this is just the first step. So that the president made announcements that these are the things that we're going to do, but the president, Congress, the administration have the opportunity to come together and do things like increase the Pell Grant that my colleague talked about, doubling Pell Grant, also controlling college costs and holding schools accountable, and reducing interest rates going forward. We recently released a report called After President Biden Cancels Student Debt that outlines how we can tackle those issues, including how we look at interest rates. Right now, the system of interest rates that we have is that everyone just pays the same. Why not have the interest rate based on needs? So if you don't make enough money, you don't pay anything in interest. If you make a lot of money, maybe you pay a little bit, something back in interest, and have that be a more progressive system for students moving forward. Or we can eliminate interest altogether. I think all those proposals should be on the table for this discussion. But, he hit the nail right on the head, is that there's more work that we need to do. There's more work that that can be done. This is still a cause for celebration. And, after we're done with the celebration, we'll get back to work and we'll keep working on this issue called higher education and college affordability.
Jalen, have you sat down and did a calculation on what your current payment is and what it will be under the new plan, particularly given the change in the repayment schedule? There has to be some saving, some additional money that's dropping to your bottom line as a result of this plan that wasn't there pre-plan.
It's, again, so my predicament is still a little different from everyone else's. If I just refer to the federal side of my loans, the pay difference is not really that significant, because even when I went through the borrower's defense, I got an email notification saying that any prolonging of the interest rates on my student loans that were like put into forbearance when I applied for the borrower defense repayment program, they're going to be added back soon. So it's just a consistent fluctuation of numbers. So I haven't been able to accurately get something, because every time I come with a calculation, it's a new protocol, a new proposal, a new rule that's been implemented. And now it switches over. And even with that, because I went to the Charlotte School of Law and they're reaching a settlement agreement, that might alter my borrower's defense repayment program for like other things that I've applied for. Because in my original story, I apologize, you two weren't there, I ended up having to go to another institution to qualify myself for law school in Baltimore, because my law school, it just bellowed out, left me with the debt. And then I couldn't even use the transcript based on how they held their courses. So I do understand the efforts and I do understand things are going on. But at the end of the day, somebody has to front that bill. And I know you were saying how with interest rates, if you make a little more money, you pay a little bit more. If you make a little less, you pay a little less. It's just a consistent pushing of debt and money and numbers around. And it falls on people who are in my category. Not the upper class, not the lower class, but the middle class trying to break into a new pay grade. And would you say?
No, I hear your story and I totally understand where you're coming from. I think, just some steps that may be helpful. So talking to the student loan ombudsman at, the Department of Education would be one thing. talking to your servicer as well could be another, beneficial step. So the president has started to provide forgiveness through the borrower defense repayment process. There was another notification that went out this week for Westwood College and students who were misled or defrauded there. So relief may be coming your way through actions that the president is starting to take through the borrower defense process. I think that through the announcement too, through this proposal for IDR, you may see your payment go down or the amount of money that's owed to you as well, and providing relief opportunities over a shorter window too if you make or had an original balance that was less than $12,000. And the department will take steps to actually recast your loan, so that might reduce your monthly payment as well. Because what happens is, like, once that $10,000 or $20,000 gets taken off, then your balance will be on something much less. And so they'll make monthly payments based off of that lower balance instead of your original balance too. So there are benefits. It's in the details. We're still waiting to see the details, but I think there are actions and steps coming, and maybe more relief that may be coming your way.
I think my issue with that response is that even in the official email sent out, I might have to wait up to 30 months to get a yes or no decision on my borrower's defense application. And then not to mention, if you run an entire campaign on, I'm going to get rid of all this debt, but then you start putting out things like, we'll just circumvent the debt, cut a little bit of interest and take some off the top. We're doing our job. I think that's the fundamental issue. What you're saying and what you ran on is not what you're actually doing in full. And granted, I'm involved in government and government agency work, cannot say out loud online in this interview, but I know how it works, and I know that it's multiple things working behind the scenes. It can't all just be, technically he could do an executive order halting the payments or getting rid of it. He hasn't abused his executive discretion as much as he could have, but it's just not, it's what you're putting out there and what you're saying is not lining up with the actual reality of things. And it's a lot of buzzwords for Americans and gaslighting of Americans, but you said you have people fighting people like, oh, I paid my loans back. I didn't pay my loans. You should forgive them. It's just a lot of mess. It's a lot of mess.
And we hear your frustration, Jalen, and you are right when you say you fall into a very unique category because you do have student loan debt above what that average is. And what your impact is going to be maybe different from that person that just has that, $20,000 or $25,000 balance. But I am going to step into the defense of Joe Biden. I think, and because you're a lawyer now, you also work in government, there is this expectation that a president in one term can do things that sophisticated people like aren't possible. It just isn't possible. And that conservatives are already up in arms and are adamantly opposed to even this $10,000 relief that Joe Biden has signed into law. And our country works when it's a bipartisan efforts when we get most things done in this country to get more student loan debt relieved, to reduce interest rates, to do some of those other things. The president, doesn't make laws. And you do know that these executive orders, if a new president comes in, he could just wipe that executive order out. And the best way we address these things is when they get made into law, because we have a Congress that works and we have Republicans and Democrats, who agree, and then bills get passed, they get signed by the president, and then it's law. Because as long as it's an executive order, it's just kind of out there. It's a great thing, as Jared said, and we should celebrate it, but it's not the law. And to make it the law, we've got to have the numbers in the House, we've got to have the numbers in the Senate, and we've got to control the White House. And that's how we get things done. And it's not going to be perfect. Politics are messy, and nobody ever feels like they get everything that they want. But you cannot deny that Joe Biden, in the short 2 years that he's been in office, given all the opposition, has done tremendous things. And I think people's expectations about what a president can do are too high. And people got to go back to their civics class and understand presidents don't make laws. They just don't. And as much as Joe Biden, I believe his heart is in the right place and wanted to do more, there are limitations to what the presidencies can do. Go ahead, Jared, jump in.
Sure. I just want to share one thing. So the president is in the process of fixing the borrower defense through repayment process. The one that I think has frustrated Jalen and his experience and many borrowers like him. And so that's something that the president committed to doing in his first term, and he's working on doing that. Final rule should be coming out, before November 1st of this year. Changes to PSLF, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, instituted a temporary waiver, is also making changes to that through the regulatory process, changing IDR. The president talked about his announcement, and also providing lots of waivers. These are historic events, and I, at least in my lifetime, have never seen the president do as much as Joe Biden has done, as far as these relief and these options for borrowers. It's a first step. I get that it doesn't solve everyone's issues, but the president, and the Department of Education have been working, full speed to implement a lot of these changes and have a system that works better for borrowers. But we do, like you said, need Congress and bipartisan efforts and laws made, and have a Congress that's willing to work with the president in order to make sure that these are long-lasting reforms and changes that really make it the best repayment system it can be.
Go ahead, Areva, jump in. Hold on a second.
My apologies.
I
quietly.
I think that I would just say that this is something that's going to help the average American. These are 45 million Americans have student loan debt. This is going to be in itself an economic stimulus, because those Americans who are making $500 a month payments on a loan that they took out 20 years ago are now going to be able to start their own businesses or own their own homes or start the family that they've been waiting on, right? Like, this is something that's going to alleviate a monthly payment for the majority of Americans who had student loan debt. And I think that in terms of who that actually is, it's really important to also just note that the amount of people who received a Pell Grant who are receiving this $20,000 loan forgiveness, 66% of them make $30,000 or less every year in our country. And so I think it's worth noting that this should have a tremendous impact on the people who are receiving it and the economy overall, because it will free up income for other spaces.
Go ahead, Jay, you want to jump in?
I think, and this will probably be my last thought on that, I think the general, students and other people in the public, I think we're just tired of seeing a lack of, for better words, a lack of force to try to do the right thing. We've seen pressure put on Congress. We've seen pressure put on the president in previous presidencies to do the right thing. And I feel like as a people, we are getting tired. You see the huge PPP loan relief, which is going on simultaneous with the student loan relief. I'm not going to draw any conspiracy lines there, but things aren't making sense as to why almost upwards of $1 billion is being forgiven with such ease. But then we get all these technicalities about interest rates, what we can and can't do when it comes to student loan debt. And then furthermore, even though, in my opinion, he was the most unsavory president alive, one thing Donald Trump did show us is how if you systematically plan certain things and plan certain outcomes and put certain pressures on certain people, you can get that derived outcome.
Oh, Jay, no.
Allow me to finish.
I will, but I want to.
I don't like that we give so much amnesty as to what a president can or cannot do, especially when it comes to helping the people of the United States. Now, granted, we have an example of somebody who did a lot of horrible things to advance a lot of horrible agendas. I feel like we can take that same power and use it to do good versus giving a lot of hollow explanations, a lot of policy jargon, and a lot of just overall fluff to kind of keep us complacent, because the things are happening in front of our face in real time.
But Jay,
students,
Trump.
No, I don't take no. I made a reference to Donald Trump as saying is we saw how much bad a president can do and how he can wield his power. And then we have a president who's doing some good, but he's not wielding his power to the fullest extent.
Well, we're probably going to agree to disagree on that, because when I look at Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first African-American woman appointed to the Supreme Court, when I look at the number of jobs that Joe Biden and his administration have created, I look at the student loan debt relief, I look at the IRA which is basically Build Back Better. I look at the efforts that have been made on climate change. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And I just approach government from an incrementalist standpoint. You are not going to get everything.
Unfortunately, it's hollow. It's hollow to me.
No,
just to me, my personal opinion, it's just hollow.
A black woman sitting on the Supreme Court. Nothing.
No. That's symbolic. That's symbolic in action. It's symbolic. It's symbolic.
You got to do some history.
If you have a majority Republican seating on the Supreme Court, and she is one black woman that is a Democrat.
But whose fault is that, Jalen? That's
not the students. That's the government's fault. That's not the people's fault.
Let me just stay focused on student loan debt. I can have a separate conversation about that. The Republican majority on the Supreme Court is because of the failed presidency of Donald Trump. And you may not like Joe Biden, and I'm not here to force you to.
No. I'm not saying that I don't like Joe Biden.
Life is always about choices, right? And it's sometimes not the perfect choice, but it's the lesser of evils. And no one that believes in voting rights, women's reproductive rights.
At what point in time do we stop having to choose between the lesser of evils?
Americans and advancing, women in this country, you could not have.
When do we have this? When do we as constituents?
Democrats and the Republicans. That's all I got to say.
When do we as constituents have to stop choosing?
Jared.
When do we as constituents who voted you guys in have to stop choosing between the lesser of two evils?
Well, that's when we change our political system in this country. It has nothing to do with Joe Biden. Let me go back to Jared. I want to ask you about where do we go from here? What's next? You talked about all these proposals that are on, that may be coming through Congress. Is there anything that we're going to see that will help expand on the work that's already been done?
Certainly. So I think, for sure, in response to the president's announcement, people are going to be having those conversations. We probably will see more activity. We saw some already from the other side of the aisle. I'm sure we'll see, more activity from, the majority, the House majority, and possibly the Senate as well, looking at how do we build off of this relief, how do we build off of this debt cancellation announcement, how do we make sure that it's successful, that, as many borrowers as possible are covered by this. And then going forward, how do we fix the system? How do we do the things that we talked about here on your show, Areva? How do we, increase the Pell Grant, decrease our reliance on student loans to begin with? How do we control college costs that have outpaced inflation for decades? How do we hold institutions accountable for misrepresenting and misleading students so that they are in debt in the first place? And how do we make good on the promise of, higher education, of, the path to economic opportunity through a college education for borrowers and for students, not just current students, but also for future students as well. And so I think those are things and conversations that are happening even now. I'm sure that they'll continue into the future and into the next Congress.
Well, I'm out of time. I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Jalen. Good luck to you. I hope that you get some relief from this bill. I hope that you see some of your debt release. You have some additional discretionary income. Thank you so much, Ariel, for joining us. Thank you for the work that your agency is doing, and always a pleasure to see you, my friend Jared. Continue to do the great work that you're doing at the Center for American Progress. I want to thank all of my guests for joining me this morning. I am also someone that borrowed a lot of loans in order to go to both college and then to go on to law school. And then I married my husband, who also had college loan debt and, law school loan debt. And we struggled like so many folks do once you graduate to pay off that student loan debt. But we did. We paid it off, and we've gone on to live happy lives. And the point of the story is that student loan debt can be crippling, but for a lot of folks, they figure out how to pay it off. And I'm not sitting around feeling like, oh my God, I don't want someone to get their loan paid off because I had to work hard to pay off my debt. That's not what we do, as Dr. Malvo said, in a civilized society. We support each other. We do things and we make sacrifices that we may not personally directly benefit from, but there is some indirect benefit to all of us by reducing the loan debt of low income and middle income students, the majority of whom are Black and brown in this country. Dr. Malvo, I think, just laid it out perfectly when she talked about helping people get into better jobs, helping them be able to start their own businesses, buy their own homes, start their families. All of that is an indirect benefit to everyone in this country. So it may not be, on your tax return, or it may not be $10,000 wiped off of some loan that you have, but you will benefit. You will absolutely positively benefit from students who are struggling to pay off their loans when those students are given some relief. Just some words of goodbye before I get out. There's a lot of conversations about fairness. Fair isn't about everybody getting the same thing. Fair is everyone getting what they need in order to be successful. Let that sink in. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.